Hi, I'm Kathleen Jasper, and today we're talking about higher order questioning, wait time, and how to avoid unison responses. If you're a brand new teacher and you don't have any idea what I'm talking about, it's okay. By the end of this short video, you will be an expert and be able to apply it to your classroom so you have engaged students and a stellar evaluation. Let's get started. All right, quick story. This is how I learned about higher order questioning, wait time, and unison responses. I'm a brand new teacher. I'm teaching 10th grade biology, and my principal is coming in to observe me. I'm nervous, but excited at the same time. I've got a great group of kids. They love to answer questions, and so I know that this is going to go very well. Finally, the principal comes in and we are in a direct instruction situation. I'm in the front of the room. We're all talking about the chapter. It happens to be on DNA replication. And I'm asking questions and they are answering. So I'm asking, what are the four nitrogen bases of the DNA molecule? And they're calling out the answers. And I ask another question and they're calling out the answers. And there's this awesome give and take. I'm feeling good about it. About 20 minutes later, after we've had a discussion and all of that, my principal gets up, smiles at me, and walks out of the room. And I think, this has gone great. I'm going to get, A++, right? So we debrief after the evaluation. He calls me down to his office. And for the most part, everything he says is great. He's like, I'm really glad you're teaching biology. He had so many good things to say. And then he says, I do have some feedback about your questioning. And I said, great. Now listen. You're going to have principals who give you feedback. Take the feedback. I learned so much from this feedback session. This one feedback session turned me into such a good teacher by just tweaking a few things, okay? He said, first, you have a lot of unison responses. And I looked at him and I didn't really know what that meant. And he said, when you ask a question, you allow the students to just call out the answers. And he said, all of your kids are engaged and it's great. But when you do that, there are other kids who don't have a chance to answer. And because they're not quick enough, they will never engage. And so I'd like you to consider going to a raise your hand kind of model so that everybody kind of gets a turn and be cognizant of who you're calling on. And I thought, wow, I never really thought about the raising of the hand thing in that way. I had such a good relationship with my kids and I thought, well, they don't really need to raise their hand. I thought it was more of like a compliance thing, but he was describing it as a participation thing, that some kids were being left behind and unable to participate because my high flyers are always going to answer the question quicker than the other kids who may not have a chance. They need a second to think. And I thought, okay, definitely that makes sense, right? Now, that was a habit I was going to have to break because we had already been through like 2 or 3 months of the school year and they had been calling out the answers. So I knew based on my understanding of procedures and routines, I was going to have to get them back into a different procedure and routine, and that was going to take practice. So I knew I had to do that. The second thing he said was, you're asking all kind of low-level questions. They're good questions. They all have to do with the standards. He said, but you never bump the rigor up. So when you ask, what are the 4 nitrogen bases of the DNA molecule, the students called out the answer, right? But those are low-level identify questions. The students can kind of find that in the book and put their finger on it. Now, if you remember last week, I did a video on Bloom's taxonomy. If you haven't seen it, I'll link it up here. That kind of recall, that identify is low-level skills. So what we want to do is bump it up, right? I mentioned in the video last week, we want to move up that pyramid. He said, consider follow-up questions that are a little more complex. So when the student answers, what are the 4 nitrogen bases of the DNA molecule? You might then ask, well, how do they work together, or how do they work, or why are they like that, or something like that. He's not a biology expert, but he told me, asking how and why really helps. And I said, that makes sense. I could really up the rigor by doing that. And I said, okay. And he said, the third thing you're going to want to do once you do up the rigor is give the student some wait time. With the unison responses, there was no wait time. Nobody had a chance to think about the question because you have these high flyers just calling it out. He said, I recommend when you ask a question, especially a higher order, so you go from the lower order question and you move to the how or why, you might say to the kids, I don't want anybody to raise their hand for 15 seconds. I want you to think about this and then raise your hand. Or when you ask a student the higher level question, so let's say the student answered the 4 nitrogen bases, the student said what they were. And then I said to that same student, okay, how do they work together? That student is going to need, 10, 15, 20 seconds to think about it, right? Be patient, step back, say, think about it for a second. I'll give you a second. And other kids might be like, I know. And it's just like, just give it a second. And if the student can't answer, you might say, do you want me to try somebody else? Okay. And you might say to the student, okay, be ready, because I might ask you another question about this. And he might say, okay. And then you might go to somebody else, but you need to give the student time. Another thing that happens, and I remember doing this as a teacher, I might ask the whole class a complex question and no hands go up and no one says anything and it's dead air. Well, I had to learn to wait the students out, because my first instinct was to run in and rescue the students. I don't like dead air. It makes me nervous. And having a bunch of 10th graders staring up at you and nobody's doing anything is very uncomfortable. But learning to get comfortable in that silence, that's where they grapple with the higher order thinking. And so when you ask the question how or why, and nobody raises their hands, just sit back and wait them out. They know you want to rescue them. They know if they wait long enough, you'll come in and give them the answers. Don't do it. So just try these things out when you are, asking questions. And another thing you can do, let's say you don't have a how or a why question on deck. Let's say you ask the student, what are the 4 nitrogen bases of the DNA molecule? And they say adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine, right? Okay, great. And then you might say to the student, all right, say more about that. And the kid's like, and you might just say, yeah, just say more about that. What's up with those 4 things? What do they do? And the student will need a second to think. And you might say, I'll give you a few seconds. Just say more about that when you're ready. And the student might say, well, they kind of attach together. Adenine goes with thymine and cytosine goes with guanine, and they attach and then they unzip during DNA replication. Notice that we just upped it. All I did was say more about that. And he went from a recall question to a more, evaluative analytical question. I just bumped the rigor by just saying, say more about that. You'll hear interviewers and podcasters say that to their guests, especially like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. They'll say, that's interesting. Say more about that. You'll hear that a lot when you're on the lookout for that. So that's another way to bump the rigor. So 3 things that I had to work on: ending unison responses, bumping the rigor of my questioning by asking how, why, and say more about that. And then wait time, pausing and allowing students to wait. Sometimes I even put a timer up. I would say, hey, I'm going to ask you a really difficult question. Some of you might think it's easy and get it right away, but I'm giving you 30 seconds and I don't want any hands raised until 30 seconds goes by. And you might click the timer for 30 seconds. All right. All of that works. Now, the last thing I'll just mention in this whole saga is that I had to break the habit of the unison responses. They were used to me allowing them to call it out. So I went back to the kids and I shared the feedback with them. I said, hey, he loved it. You all did a great job. There's a couple of things I need to work on as a teacher. Number 1, I need to bump the rigor. I'm going to ask you more difficult questions. Number 2, we're going to take some time to answer it. And number 3, and really important, we're going to start raising our hand to answer the question so everybody gets a chance to engage. And I said, so when I ask a question, I want you guys to raise your hand. Now, the first couple of times when I did it during direct instruction, they called out again because they were used to calling out. And I said, oh, let's stop. Raise our hand. Okay, let's raise our hand. I had to do that over and over again for, a couple of days. And by day 2, they were good. It's those procedures and routines I had to reinforce because we had gotten into some bad habits and some bad routines. So I just went through and I worked on raising the hand. They got it. And once I told them, like, I got this feedback and I really want to implement it, they wanted to help me implement it. And so they were aware of what's going on and they were better equipped to help me be a better teacher. So I always recommend, when you can, communicate with the kids because they like it. It kind of gives them insight into what's going on. So I hope that helps you today. Remember, avoid unison responses, up the rigor of your questioning by asking how, why, and say more about that. and give the students wait time so they have a minute to think about the question and give you a good answer. And it also allows everyone to participate in the questioning activities. Hope that helped you today. If you have any questions, you can throw them in the comments below. Consider subscribing to this YouTube channel and liking this video. I hope you have an awesome day and that these techniques work for you in the classroom. Bye.